So this week we're hearing Rob Miller speak on Did the Resurrection Really Happen? Let's just give him a warm welcome and then off he will go.
Thanks, Peter. There's a handout. Okay, thanks everyone. It's great to be with you and really good to be able to talk about this topic. So I just want to begin by raising the issue of what people believe about death and life after death. And it's worth acknowledging that in our world there are lots of different beliefs about that. Many people today believe that death is just the end, that there is no hope beyond death, and so really matters is how you live your life now and making the best of this life, because you're a long time dead, as the Australian saying goes. Probably even more people than that, believe that there is some kind of life after death, some kind of spiritual existence, even if they're not quite sure what that might be. That's still the case that most people don't think death is the end, or think it probably isn't. And there are various kind of thoughts about what that might mean, whether it's reincarnation or some kind of spiritual existence in heaven or something like that. But Christians have a very specific belief about these things, a very specific hope, which is actually much larger and more substantial than merely the hope that life might somehow go on after death, but is a hope that is to do with the resurrection. That is the complete overcoming and defeat of death and decay. A hope which is about human life in bodily form that is eternal. Well, why is that? Why do Christians believe that? It's to do with the claim that one person, in particular Jesus from Nazareth, was raised from death. That though he was crucified by the Romans, though he died and was buried, he was raised again by God from death. And that this event provides the basis for a strong and a reasonable hope that death is not the end of life. So how did Christians get to the point of believing this? And what sort of evidence is there for this kind of belief about Jesus and therefore about the hope that human beings have? Well, I want to just talk about 4 key factors that I think are part of the picture. And as we do this, really try and think in terms of how would a historian approach this question, and maybe have a bit more to say about that towards the end. But 4 key things that are worth thinking about, and that any kind of account of what happened with Jesus really needs to think about. That all of these things are involved and need to form some kind of unity, need to be connected in some way in our thinking, whether you believe in Jesus' resurrection or not. Before we get there, I just want to make a couple of comments about resurrection and thinking about it in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And this in some ways just sort of clears the ground a bit in terms of actually being clear about what we're talking about here. So what do people believe? Well, for most people in the Roman Empire, say, they were pagans in their belief. I don't use the word in a pejorative sense. That is, that they believed in the gods, and they had various beliefs to do with afterlife that came from that. And it's fair to say that by and large, Greek culture, the dominant culture, was dualistic. It was dualistic in this sense that it believed that human beings were made up of a soul, a spiritual aspect, and a body, physical aspect, and that the soul, the spiritual aspect, was the real thing, the real essence of a human being, and the body was merely a shell. And that essentially we are a soul trapped in a body. They probably recognise that kind of way of talking, that human beings are in the physical world, but that the physical world is at best indifferent, at worst evil. That the physical world is not really spiritual, nothing to do with the real spiritual stuff. And the real goal of things is to escape from the physical world, to be just a soul set free from this world. So for pagans, resurrection was neither possible, really, and if it was possible, it certainly wasn't desirable. It's not something that you would yearn for if the whole point was really to get away from the body and to be a soul set free, a spirit set free. For Jews, there was some variety of beliefs in Judaism about resurrection. One of the minor but influential party that included many of the elite was the Sadducees. And the Sadducees believed that there is no resurrection. So they were like pagans in the sense that they didn't believe that resurrection was going to happen, and it was not something people should hope in. That's described in Mark 12:18, by the way, if you want to look it up in the Bible. And the majority party, the mainstream of Judaism was the Pharisees, and their belief was that all the people, everyone, or at least all the faithful people of God, would be raised at the end of time. So when God's kingdom came and when history came to an end, that God would raise all of the dead. And you can find this kind of belief expressed by Martha in John chapter 11 verse 24, when she's talking to Jesus, and she says about her brother Lazarus who has died, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And in saying that about her brother, Martha is merely saying what was mainstream Jewish belief at the time, that everyone would be raised by God, and that God would gather his faithful people to himself. So basically those are the two main options, either no resurrection or general resurrection. Those were the beliefs on offer in the ancient world. But it's worth saying that it was always about bodily existence. That is, resurrection, when you use the word resurrection, you meant a human body coming back to life. It wasn't just a way of talking about something else. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal language about a body coming back to life, or someone coming back or with a physical body. And that both pagans and Jews had other words to describe other kinds of life after death, other concepts for life after death, like being a ghost or being a spirit or other things as well. That they had a specific meaning to the word resurrection, and they had other words to talk about other kinds of life after death experiences. Okay, that's a bit of background, which I hope will help us as we go along. Okay, so the four key factors in thinking about Jesus' resurrection. First of all, before and after. Before and after. So before. And here we just need to think a little bit about the career of Jesus as it's reported in the Gospels. That not only do the Gospels report Jesus going around teaching and gathering followers, but also quite a number of miraculous occurrences happening as part of Jesus' ministry. Healings, exorcisms, events like the feeding of thousands of people, this calming of the storm, and so on. Or various reports of miraculous events happening. The interesting thing about this in the Gospels is that they are reported, and also criticism of Jesus is reported as well. So the Gospel writers include people criticising Jesus, and what they criticise Jesus for is the source of his power. So the criticism isn't Jesus is faking it, or these aren't real events, but rather Jesus is able to do these things by the power of the devil or some evil power or satanic, demonic power. In other words, everyone agreed that Jesus was doing extraordinary things. They just disagreed about where the power came from. That's interesting. And secondly, beforehand, we have three raisings. That is, Jesus is reported in the Gospels as bringing back to life three people who had died. Lazarus in John chapter 11, the widow of Nain's son in Luke chapter 7, and the daughter of Jairus, Mark chapter 5. And here Jesus Jesus' power is to bring people from death back to life. But these things are not reported as resurrections, interestingly. It's more like, the people didn't see this and say resurrection. It really comes across more like an extreme healing, a radical healing, that they really were very sick, and that Jesus has brought them back from that, but they're going to die again. They haven't been resurrected. They've just been healed from death, as it were, temporarily. Okay, so you've got that, all these things reported as going on beforehand, so that has to form part of our thinking about the whole Jesus event. Then we have afterwards. What happened after? And this is about the strange thing that the first Christians were preaching, were proclaiming. And here it's worth thinking about what they didn't do after Jesus died. What they didn't do. And this is a kind of exercise in imagination, trying to think about what the other options might have been, because we know what happened in history, and so actually sometimes you need to think about what could have happened but didn't. I think this is what Sherlock Holmes described as the dogs that don't bark, the dogs that never barked. Okay, so never mind that. It's thinking about the things that didn't happen as well as the things that did happen. What didn't happen? Well, first of all, the disciples of Jesus, after Jesus died, they didn't go, well, I guess that means he's not the Messiah. Let's look around for another one, for another possibility, because clearly it's not Jesus. So but we do believe that God is going to send his Messiah, so we're going to look for another Messiah. That would be one thing that they could have done. Another thing that they could have done would be to build a tomb. So many people recognised as prophets in Judaism and other religions in the ancient world, if they died, people would go, well, the proper thing to do is honour them by building a suitable tomb where their memory can be preserved. But they didn't do that either.
But wasn't it placed in the tomb?
Oh, I mean, like building memorial, a grand tomb. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yes. What else didn't they do? They didn't say that they'd had a vision of Jesus. This idea of having a vision is a very well-known phenomenon in Judaism and in other religions. They didn't say that had a vision that they saw Jesus. That's not what they said, not what they proclaimed. And they didn't say Jesus survived. They didn't say, guess what? Jesus cheated death. He endured the cross and he came through on the other side still alive. Because that would have been pretty amazing. That would be worth telling people about, but no, they didn't say that either. What they did say was that one person had been resurrected by God in the middle of human history, if you want to put it that way. One person. Not a general resurrection, but just one person had been raised. And they proclaimed this thing to Jews and to non-Jews, to everyone. Jews would have reason not to believe this. They believed in a general resurrection. Pagans would have reasons not to believe this. They didn't believe in resurrection at all. But here come the first Christians proclaiming that one person has been resurrected. And what they were saying about Jesus was not just that he was still alive, let alone that he'd survived, but that he'd been transformed. That he had actually gone through death and come out the other side, if you like. That it wasn't just that death had been reversed like Jesus did for Lazarus, but Jesus had been raised through and from death, not as a spirit or ghost or an angel, but as a human being with a real human body. But now without our frailty and limitations, raised to life forever with God. So here's the question: why did those first Christians proclaim such an aberrant and idiosyncratic thing? Something so out of the blue that no one had really ever spoken about it before as a concept. The idea that one person would experience what God had promised to do for everyone at the end of time. Why did they do that? Well, here we get to the final 2 points, the direct evidence. And here there are really two things. The empty tomb of Jesus and the appearances of Jesus, or the encounters that the disciples of Jesus had with him risen from the dead. The empty tomb and the encounters. So first of all, the empty tomb. So just need to think back on events here. That Jesus was arrested on what we would call a Thursday night and put on trial over the course of the night and ordered to be crucified by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate on what we would call the Friday morning, and led out and crucified at what we would call 9 o'clock, third hour, 9 o'clock in the morning roughly. Jesus suffered on the cross for 6 hours. He died relatively quickly, so it only took 6 hours. Once Jesus had died, they checked that he was dead by spearing him in the side. Apparently the normal way of just making sure someone was really dead, doing something violent enough that they'd react to it if there was any life still in them. Jesus was definitely dead. They didn't have to break his legs like they normally did with people to end it. And he was taken down from the cross. A man named Joseph, who was part of the Jewish ruling council, a wealthy man, went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus, received permission to take Jesus' body, had it taken down from the cross and buried in a tomb, presumably the tomb that Joseph had bought for himself. So as a wealthy person, buying a tomb in advance, which seems like a fairly morbid thing to do, but I actually have seen people lining up outside Melbourne Cemetery to get a good grave plot when they've been put on offer, so it does happen. Okay, so Joseph has a tomb available. Jesus is placed in the tomb, wrapped in linen cloths, and a stone rolled in front of to seal it off. So it's a fairly standard burial, but for a wealthy and important person in Jerusalem society. So Jesus is there, placed it there on the Friday afternoon. All this accomplished in a hurry before the Sabbath starts. And then the Sabbath starts at Friday sundown, and so nothing happens on the Saturday. It's the Sabbath. Everyone obeys the Sabbath and doesn't do anything on the Saturday. And then as soon as they're allowed to, some of the women followers of Jesus go to the tomb because they want to put spices prepare his body properly for burial, since they assume it's been done in too rushed a way on the Friday night. When they get to the tomb, the stone has been rolled away and the tomb is empty. They run off, scared. They tell the disciples about it. Some of the disciples go to the tomb and also discover the tomb empty, and they meet messengers from God, they're angels, who tell them that Jesus has been raised. So that's the tomb itself. In the tomb they find the grave clothes, the linen cloths that Jesus was wrapped in, folded there in the tomb. So that's the first part of the direct evidence. The second part is the appearances. Once the tomb's been found empty, the disciples start encountering Jesus in various situations. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus appears to two disciples who are getting out of Jerusalem, and who then return to Jerusalem. They discover that Jesus has already appeared to Peter, and then Jesus appears to the disciples there in that room. And this is followed by a series of other appearances over the course of 40 days. I printed there for you on the sheet, I think, some words from 1 Corinthians 15. So the Gospels, of course, include reports of Jesus' appearance to various people at various times. But it's not the only written evidence for the resurrection. And in fact, the letters in the New Testament are an earlier source. So we're probably not used to thinking this way, but the letters actually were written before the Gospels by and large, and some of the letters quite a bit earlier than the Gospels. So, for example, this letter, 1 Corinthians, well, look, the earliest letter we have in the New Testament is almost certainly 1 Thessalonians, and it doesn't talk about Jesus' resurrection. It just clearly assumes that Jesus is alive and talks about Jesus returning. So, and that's probably about 52 or earlier AD. But this letter, 1 Corinthians, is probably written in 55 or so. And you'll notice here that Paul refers to what he told them previously when he visited them, which we think around 50. And he refers to the tradition that he himself had received, almost certainly referring to when he visited Jerusalem and met the apostles in around 38 AD. So roughly 5 years after the event. So here Paul is reporting what he heard 5 years or so after Jesus died. So we're talking about a written source which is fairly close, about 20 years away from the events that it's talking about, but actually reporting earlier talk about this that goes back much closer to the event itself. This is what he said. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So Paul here refers, clearly referring to tradition that he didn't make up, but that he received from others, a body of, or collection of references to different appearances of Jesus that had been gathered together, and that he just sees himself as responsible for passing on. And you'll see that there are quite a number of different appearances. Some of those we can identify from the Gospels. Others are unknown to us from the Gospels. If you add up all the different appearances in all of the New Testament, then you can identify probably 10 different occasions on which Jesus appeared to people over the course of 40 days, different groups of people in different places, both in Galilee and in Jerusalem. Some of them individuals or groups of a couple of people, some of them the 12 disciples, some of them much larger groups like the group of 500. And Paul says that that many of them are still living, and presumably you could check with them that this is true, that their eyewitness was available to people who investigated. 9 or 10 different appearances over that time. And that these appearances were enough to convince them not just that Jesus was alive, but that he was bodily alive, that he wasn't a ghost, that he wasn't a spirit or an apparition. This wasn't just a vision that they were receiving from heaven, but that they were actually meeting with and able to touch Jesus, and that he was able to do things like eat. In other words, very much a bodily existence. And so it's the two things together, the empty tomb and the appearances, which are the primary sort of evidence. But they fit together with, I want to suggest to you, with what happens before, the miraculous events in the Gospels, and with what happens after the proclamation that Jesus had been raised to eternal life before. So as people are kind of chewing over this kind of evidence, what sort of things are they asking? And here, you can think about the way historians do history and the way, say, lawyers do evidence. And actually they're quite similar in lots of ways. And so historians and legal professionals have been some of the key kind of people who have thought over the question of the resurrection over the years. Historians ask things like this, and especially with ancient history, they're asking about the sources. Are events attested by multiple sources? They're thinking about the closeness of the sources to the events themselves. How great a distance separates the writing of the story from the historical event itself. They're thinking about what's the relationship between the sources. Is one source just relying on another, in which case it doesn't really add anything to the picture? And what you have here, actually, you have multiple sources close in time to the event, and not relying on each other necessarily. Because some of the reporting is being passed on, but in lots of ways you have various kind of angles on the resurrection happening from the various gospel writers and the various other New Testament writers as well. What are some things that lawyers ask? Well, they ask, when people are reporting an event, do they all say the same thing? If their testimony is too similar, then it sounds like collusion and fabrication. If the testimony is too different, then it sounds like it's unbelievable. It's not reliable. What you have in the New Testament actually is enough variation that you can see that it's not collusion, but enough uniformity that you can see the same event is being reported. Here's what one legal expert, Sir Norman Anderson, wrote, and this is his book called Jesus, the Witness of History. The minor differences in detail that we see in the Gospels are quite characteristic of the testimony of multiple witnesses to the same event, and are in fact exactly what we would expect to see if their testimony was true and they did not conspire in advance to agree on a story. So I think that the evidence is good in terms of the written sources, and I think that, as I say, those four factors create a coherent picture which needs to be explained in some way. Of course, many people have doubted that this could have happened, and there have been all kinds of alternate theories about the resurrection. Let me just mention a few. First of all is the famous Swoon Theory. Swoon Theory is not the name of a band, but is actually the theory that Jesus survived the crucifixion, that he didn't die on the cross but merely swooned, became unconscious, but the Romans mistakenly thought he was dead and took him down. He was taken down from the cross, and in the tomb he was able to revive and appear to the disciples, and this sparked belief in the resurrection. Well, part of the problem, there are lots of problems with it, but part of the problem, of course, is that the Romans were thorough and did check that Jesus was dead by sticking a spear into him. Apart from the unlikelihood of Jesus reviving after the experience of crucifixion for 6 hours, there really is no way that the disciples seeing Jesus hobble out of the tomb would mistake his tortured body for a resurrected one. That they would have seen it and said, and they might have been excited, they might have been incredibly impressed that Jesus had survived, but they would not have said, now that's resurrection. They wouldn't have said, Jesus has entered a whole new stage of human life. But rather that would have recognised that he was someone who survived torture and was not going to survive much longer. It doesn't really explain their proclamation about Jesus. Second theory, that the disciples went to the wrong tomb. But this, of course, doesn't explain the appearances, and it would have been quite possible for the Jewish or the Roman authorities to point out the correct tomb. Okay, you went to the wrong place. Here is Jesus' tomb, and here is Jesus' body. Third theory is that the body of Jesus was stolen. It could have been stolen by grave robbers. Though this seems unlikely because of the grave clothes being left behind. The linen cloths were the actual valuable thing in the tomb, and these were the thing that were not removed, were not missing from the tomb. So it does seem unlikely that we're talking about a grave robbery. Or a variation on this is that the disciples stole the body. At this point you have a very strange conspiracy to steal Jesus' body away and then to proclaim him as Messiah and Saviour of the world. That this was a weird thing for them to do, and certainly an especially weird thing for them to be prepared to die for. The people might die for something that they believe to be true, which isn't true, but it's very unlikely that people will willingly die for something that they know to be a lie. And so that would leave a rather gaping hole in history in terms of their motivation for proclaiming Jesus. Fourthly, that it was just merely a conspiracy, a fabrication. The problem here is that once again the tomb could have been, it would just simply be a matter of locating the tomb of Jesus and showing that he was really dead. The main problem with any kind of conspiracy theory is actually has been answered really in modern times by the observation that if it was a conspiracy, it was an incredibly incompetent one, because women are recorded as being the first witnesses to the empty tomb and among the first to meet Jesus risen from the dead. And since their testimony was not considered admissible or credible in the ancient world, it does seem a strange thing to do to fabricate stories about a resurrection and then include unreliable witnesses in the account. So it's just one of the things that's really been noticed in modern times about this story. A fifth idea has been that the disciples experienced a mass hallucination. And this kind of sounds credible in some ways, except one small problem with it is there really is no such thing. That is, people experience hallucinations. They almost always experience them as individuals. And sane people who experience hallucinations then come to recognise that they were hallucinating afterwards. The disciples, I think, clearly were not insane as a group. And so the problem is there is actually no precedent for something called mass hallucination. There is such a thing as mass hysteria. That's actually quite a different phenomenon, and not about multiple groups of multiple people seeing the same thing, which just basically doesn't happen. So it sounded really. Whenever people say mass hallucination, people tend to be impressed by it, but actually, unfortunately, there just isn't such a phenomenon. Apart from that, we certainly have a number of unwilling witnesses to Jesus being alive. That is, not just people who were suggestible, as it were, but people who were reluctant to believe that this was true. So you have Thomas, for example. You have James, the brother of Jesus. And then, as Paul says, there's Paul himself, not in quite the same way as the others. He experienced Jesus as alive in a vision, which is different from their encounter with Jesus bodily, but nevertheless, here are people who were reluctant to believe this, but who were persuaded by their experience of meeting Jesus. Contemporary skeptics have tended to create some kind of hybrid of a number of these elements to come up with some kind of theory to explain the evidence. And I think what happens is they end up with a story so complicated and convoluted that it's actually much less believable than the gospel accounts taken at face value. Actually, if you applied Occam's razor to their theory, I think you would stick with a much more simple biblical account. But of course, some people need to come up with an alternative theory, and the reason is basically because of their assumptions, their philosophical presuppositions that this is not something that could happen. The resurrection didn't happen because resurrections can't happen, and therefore, based on those assumptions, you need to search for some kind of alternative theory. In fact, our resident atheist here at Christian Union, who was here for a number of years, has now left uni, was insistent on this point that and he came up with his own alternative theory because it simply could not have happened based on his presuppositions that the physical world is all that exists, that there is no possibility of miracles or resurrection, and therefore you need some kind of alternative explanation. He even said that even if God appeared to him directly, he would not believe in God. And the reason was because he would assume that he was mistaken. So at that point, I think you kind of need to say, well, that person's presuppositions are so set in stone that they're impervious to any evidence. But I think perhaps a more open-minded attitude to the evidence would mean that a person would be ready to question their presuppositions. That actually the evidence for the resurrection is so compelling that it should be sufficient for someone to say, maybe my presuppositions are wrong. Especially the presupposition that the physical material world is all that exists. It's not a belief based on science or anything like that. That is a presupposition. That is a philosophical position, and it should be open to question if sufficient evidence arises to suggest otherwise. Okay. Well, what difference does it make? I think it makes a lot of difference in terms of, first of all, your view of Jesus, of course. If here is someone who died and came back to life, then that would change your whole view of Jesus. But it's also very significant in thinking about your view of death. If Jesus was raised, it means there's the possibility that death is not the end. And actually, as Paul says here, that actually dying would really just be a kind of big sleep. He talks about people having, in this passage, he says, some of whom are still living, most of whom are still living, but some have fallen asleep. He's not just using a euphemism there. He's not afraid to use the word death, but he's not just using a euphemism like passed away. When he says fallen asleep, he really means that's the way we think about it now. That's the way we think about it. That for someone who believes in Jesus, death is like falling asleep, and because we believe that Jesus can wake you up again. Jesus can bring you back to life because he is alive forever. Well, I might stop there.